In a revealing letter, Mr. Darcy provided a detailed account of the intricate ties between his family and George Wickham. Wickham's late father served Mr. Darcy's family for many years, overseeing the Pemberley farms. Mr. Darcy, out of kindness, supported George's education with the hope that he would enter the church. However, upon discovering Wickham's moral shortcomings, Mr. Darcy rescinded an offer for a church post. Despite settling the matter, George approached Mr. Darcy again, seeking the rector's position. Mr. Darcy declined, citing concerns about George's character. This led to accusations of injustice from George. Another regrettable incident involved Mr. Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, and an attempted elopement by George. Fortunately, Mr. Darcy intervened upon discovering the situation. The complexities of these connections were explained by Mr. Darcy, who encouraged the recipient to consult Colonel Fitzwilliam, his cousin and close friend, for confirmation of the details. The letter evoked a range of emotions in Elizabeth as she reconsidered her earlier judgments. Initially surprised by Mr. Darcy's apology, she grappled with anger but found herself reevaluating her perceptions as she read his detailed account. The realization of her own misjudgments and pride prompted Elizabeth to re-examine her understanding of both Wickham and Mr. Darcy. In the end, she acknowledged her previous errors and gained a deeper self-awareness. In response to Charlotte's earlier comments, Elizabeth, upon re-examining Mr. Darcy's critique of her family, experienced a profound sense of shame. She acknowledged the validity of his words, feeling more miserable than ever. Returning to the rectory, Elizabeth struggled to maintain a cheerful demeanor. The departure of Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam from Rosings was keenly felt by their aunt, who, now lacking entertainment, frequently invited the Collinses and their visitors. With only a few days left in her visit, Elizabeth found solace in occupying her time. When alone, she would stroll in the garden or park, committing Mr. Darcy's letter to memory. Although still angered by Darcy's proud proposal, Elizabeth directed her anger inward, recognizing the unjust criticisms she had levied against him. While she respected his character and pitied his disappointment, she harbored no desire to see him again. Contemplating her family, Elizabeth lamented her father's indulgence toward Kitty and Lydia's foolishness. Her mother, oblivious to any wrongdoing, contributed to the family's flawed behavior. Reflecting on Jane's disappointment in love, Elizabeth acknowledged the indirect role her family had played in it. Returning home on Saturday, Elizabeth bid farewell to Charlotte, feeling sorry for her friend's choice of husband. Mr. Collins, expressing hope for Elizabeth's happiness in marriage, received a cautious response. In London, Elizabeth planned to stay with her aunt for a few days before the opportunity to discuss Mr. Darcy's letter with Jane. Back in Longbourn, Elizabeth became acutely aware of Lydia's silliness. The news of the regiment leaving Meryton for Brighton created excitement in the Bennet household, with Lydia and her mother eager to follow the officers to Brighton for the summer. Elizabeth, however, felt confident that her father would not entertain such a foolish idea. In a private conversation with Jane, Elizabeth shared the details of Darcy's marriage proposal and the shocking revelations about George Wickham's character. They decided to keep the information about Wickham to themselves, considering his imminent departure from Meryton. Elizabeth felt a sense of relief in unburdening herself of two secrets. Elizabeth was certain that Jane would be a willing listener whenever she wished to discuss either of the two secrets. However, she refrained from revealing the third secret to Jane. Instead, she explained Bingley's sincere feelings for Jane, sensing Jane's unhappiness due to her continued warm affection for him. With little chance of Bingley marrying Jane now, Elizabeth chose not to deepen Jane's feelings of regret for her lost happiness. In the week preceding the regiment's departure from Meryton, the young ladies in the area, aside from the two elder Miss Bennets, became extremely depressed. Kitty and Lydia scolded Elizabeth for her apparent hard-heartedness as they bemoaned the impending departure of the officers. Mrs. Bennet shared in their sadness, recalling the departure of Colonel Miller's regiment 25 years ago. Lydia's bitterness turned to delight when she received an invitation from Colonel Foster's wife to accompany them to Brighton with the regiment. Mrs. Forster, a young and cheerful woman, had been friendly with Lydia for 2 months. While poor Kitty felt upset at not being included, Lydia cared little for her sister's feelings, exuberantly celebrating her invitation. Elizabeth, unable to share Lydia's happiness, felt a duty to advise her father to refuse permission for Lydia to go. However, Mr. Bennet did not see any real danger and approved the arrangements. Elizabeth remained worried about Lydia's behavior in the more liberated atmosphere of Brighton, considering the temptations of a fashionable seaside town. Since her return from Kent, Elizabeth had seen Mr. Wickham regularly, but his attempts to transfer his affections back to her had become apparent. Elizabeth, annoyed by his confidence in his own charm, spoke coldly to him during their last meeting before the regiment's departure. She mentioned her frequent meetings with Mr. Darcy and expressed a favorable opinion of his character. This led to an embarrassed parting between Elizabeth and Wickham, possibly with a mutual desire never to meet again. As Lydia left for Brighton, Elizabeth endured constant complaints from Mrs. Bennet and Kitty about the dullness of Longbourn. Fortunately, she looked forward to an upcoming trip with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner to the Lake District, although it had to be shortened to 3 weeks due to Mr. Gardiner's business commitments. The Gardiners, unable to comfortably visit the entire Lake District, suggested a trip to Derbyshire instead, an area with a strong attraction for Mrs. Gardiner due to her early life there. Though Elizabeth was disappointed, she accepted the new plan, confident in avoiding Mr. Darcy at Pemberley. 4 weeks later, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner arrived at Longbourn, leaving their children in Jane's care. The next day, accompanied by Elizabeth, they embarked on their journey, proving to be excellent traveling companions with shared interests and affection. After exploring Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, and Birmingham, they arrived in Derbyshire, choosing to stay in the small town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had lived before marriage. Elizabeth discovered that Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's house, was only 8 kilometers away. Mrs. Gardiner proposed visiting Pemberley the next day, recounting her fond memories of the place. Elizabeth, feigning disinterest in large country houses, hesitated, fearing an encounter with Mr. Darcy. However, after confirming that he was not at home, she agreed to the suggestion. The next morning, Mr. Gardiner arranged for a carriage, and they entered Pemberley Park. Driving through a beautiful wood, they reached a hilltop for their first view of Pemberley House across a valley. The large, handsome stone building blended naturally into the picturesque surroundings. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner admired it warmly, and at that moment, Elizabeth entertained the thought that being the mistress of Pemberley might be worthwhile. They approached the front door and requested permission to visit the house. The Pemberley housekeeper, a respectable elderly woman, guided them through the rooms, all elegantly yet sensibly furnished. Every window offered an attractive view, and Elizabeth began to appreciate the owner's taste in everything she observed. While touring Pemberley, Elizabeth couldn't help but entertain the thought, "I might have been mistress of this place." However, she quickly quashed any hint of regret, reminding herself that she could never have invited her vulgar family connections. The fortunate realization saved her from dwelling on what could have been. Curiosity lingered, and Elizabeth longed to inquire about Mr. Darcy's whereabouts. Luckily, her uncle asked the question, discovering that Mr. Darcy was expected to arrive the next day with a group of friends. Elizabeth, relieved that their visit had not been delayed, was spared from the possibility of encountering Mr. Darcy. As Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner conversed with the housekeeper, Elizabeth overheard praise for Mr. Darcy. The housekeeper portrayed him as a handsome, kind, and generous master, dispelling any notions of pride. Elizabeth listened with astonishment, wondering if this could be the same Mr. Darcy she had always found disagreeable. The housekeeper spoke highly of Mr. Darcy's character, emphasizing his kindness and the praise from everyone who knew him. Elizabeth found herself standing in front of a painting of Mr. Darcy, smiling in a way that felt familiar to her. Silently contemplating the image, she began to feel a warmth towards him that she hadn't experienced since their first meeting. Realizing she had underestimated Mr. Darcy's character, Elizabeth appreciated the housekeeper's positive opinion, considering the value of praise from an intelligent servant. As they completed the tour of public rooms, the gardener was called to show them the park and gardens. As they walked away from the house, Elizabeth turned for one last look and was surprised to see the owner of Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, emerging suddenly from behind the house. Within 20 meters of each other, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy couldn't avoid locking eyes, and both blushed. Though he seemed surprised, Mr. Darcy quickly recovered and approached Elizabeth with perfect politeness. Despite her astonishment and confusion, Elizabeth received his greetings with embarrassment. After a brief exchange, Mr. Darcy left her to return to the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, who had observed the encounter from a distance, expressed admiration for Mr. Darcy's appearance. However, Elizabeth could only think of her own feelings, feeling unfortunate that she had come. She blushed again, worried that it might appear as if she had planned the meeting. Mr. Darcy's behavior seemed different. He spoke politely and gently, leaving Elizabeth puzzled about its meaning. With these thoughts occupying her mind, Elizabeth joined her uncle and aunt in a walk through the gardens. As they strolled beside a charming stream, they noticed Mr. Darcy approaching again. This time, Elizabeth controlled herself better and returned his greetings politely. She couldn't help but smile when he asked for the honor of being introduced to her friends, as he likely wasn't expecting well-mannered gardeners to be her low-born relations. Mr. Darcy appeared surprised but engaged in a conversation with Mr. Gardiner, showing genuine interest. On their way back to the house, Mr. Darcy walked beside Elizabeth. After a short silence, she mentioned that the housekeeper had informed them he wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. Mr. Darcy explained that he came early on business and that the rest of the party, including Mr. Bingley and his sisters, would be arriving tomorrow. He also mentioned that there was someone else who particularly wished to meet Elizabeth, his sister. Flattered by the compliment, Elizabeth gave her permission. Upon arriving at the house, Mr. Darcy offered them refreshments, which they politely refused. He then assisted the ladies into the carriage, and as it drove away from Pemberley, Elizabeth watched him walking slowly back towards the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were effusive in their praise of Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth remained reserved, saying very little. The next morning, Mr. Darcy brought his sister to visit Elizabeth and the Gardiners at the hotel in Lambton. The Gardiners were astonished by the honor, but Elizabeth's visible embarrassment and Darcy's haste in making the visit immediately provided them with an explanation. Observing their niece and Darcy carefully during the visit, they couldn't doubt that the gentleman was in love, though they weren't certain about the lady's feelings. Elizabeth was delighted to find that Georgiana Darcy, far from being proud as Wickham had claimed, was shy with quiet, gentle manners. It was evident that she greatly admired her brother and intended to like Miss Bennet, as Darcy had spoken favorably of her. Elizabeth was also satisfied to see that Bingley, who was with the Darcys, did not seem particularly interested in Georgiana, despite Caroline Bingley's wishes. She had to admit that she had never seen Mr. Darcy behave so sociably and pleasantly, not only toward herself but also toward the relations to whom he had referred with disdain during their last conversation in Hunsford Rectory. During the visit, Elizabeth, determined to make herself agreeable, succeeded in creating a pleasant atmosphere. Encouraged by her brother, Darcy invited Elizabeth and the Gardiners to dinner at Pemberley in 2 days. The Darcys and Mr. Bingley left with warm expressions of politeness on both sides. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were curious about their niece's feelings for Mr. Darcy but refrained from questioning her that evening. Elizabeth, lying awake for 2 whole hours, pondered her evolving sentiments toward him. She now regarded him with respect and a certain admiration, deeply grateful not only for his past love but also for forgiving her bitter rejection and unjust accusations. She considered the change in a man once so proud to be a result of his love for her. Now, with a growing certainty that she could encourage him to propose again, Elizabeth contemplated her feelings. Elizabeth received 2 letters from Jane during her visit to Lambton. The first letter, which had been badly addressed and redirected, started as expected with descriptions of Longbourn dinner parties and visits. However, the second half, dated a day later, revealed unexpected and serious news. In the hurried second letter, Jane informed Elizabeth that Lydia had run away to Scotland with one of Colonel Forster's officers, who turned out to be Wickham. The elopement was surprising, and Jane expressed concern without alarming her sister. Lydia's impulsive action meant that she could marry without her parents' approval. Jane noted that while it was a foolish marriage for both, at least Wickham wasn't interested in Lydia's limited financial resources, knowing that Mr. Bennet could provide her with very little. Kitty, it appeared, had known about Lydia's attachment to Wickham through Lydia's letters. Mrs. Bennet was deeply upset, and Jane concluded the letter abruptly, mentioning her inability to stay away from her distressed mother for long. Without allowing herself time to process the news, Elizabeth opened the second letter, dated a day later. In this letter, Jane expressed confusion and acknowledged the potential foolishness of a marriage between Lydia and Wickham. However, she now anxiously hoped that the marriage had indeed taken place. There was reason to fear otherwise, as Colonel Forster, who arrived the day before, revealed that one of the officers, a close friend of Wickham, believed that Wickham never intended to go to Scotland or marry Lydia at all. The situation was dire, leaving Elizabeth in suspense and anxiety about her sister's fate. In Jane's letter, Elizabeth learned that Colonel Forster had followed Lydia and Wickham as far as London, but the couple had not been seen leaving the capital. The family's anxiety was profound, with Mr. and Mrs. Bennet fearing the worst and Colonel Forster expressing concern about Wickham's trustworthiness. Jane, however, couldn't believe Wickham to be so wicked, and she found it impossible to believe that Lydia, too, lacked morals to the extent of living with a man without being married. Jane's letter conveyed the deteriorating situation at home. Mrs. Bennet was really ill. Mr. Bennet was unusually angry, and Kitty was being scolded for keeping Lydia's attachment a secret. Jane implored Elizabeth to return home as soon as possible, seeking their uncle's advice and help. She particularly relied on their uncle's goodness. Overwhelmed by the distressing news, Elizabeth rushed to find Mr. Gardiner immediately, feeling there was not a moment to lose. However, just as she reached the door, Mr. Darcy entered. Elizabeth's pale face and strange manner prevented him from speaking. Elizabeth, who could think of nothing but Lydia, hurriedly excused herself, expressing the urgency to find Mr. Gardiner. Darcy, concerned for her well-being, offered to call someone to look after her or get her a glass of wine. Elizabeth declined, stating that she was quite well but upset by dreadful news from Longbourn. She then burst into tears and, after a few minutes, explained to Darcy the heartbreaking situation. Her youngest sister, Lydia, had eloped with Mr. Wickham. Knowing Wickham's character, Elizabeth blamed herself for not disclosing what she knew about him to her family earlier. She regretfully acknowledged that Lydia had no money or connections that could induce Wickham to marry her, and she believed that Lydia had lost her chance for a respectable marriage forever. In her distress, Elizabeth wished she had taken action sooner to prevent the tragedy. Darcy, shocked and saddened, watched her in sympathetic silence. Elizabeth, filled with anxiety and regret, revealed to Mrs. Gardiner that she and Jane were aware of Wickham's dishonesty and false accusations against Mr. Darcy and his family. They had decided not to make this knowledge public, believing Lydia would not be in danger from Wickham. However, Elizabeth admitted that this decision had been a mistake. As they traveled back to Longbourn, Elizabeth and her aunt discussed their concerns about Lydia's situation. Mrs. Gardiner expressed disbelief that Wickham would be capable of running away with Lydia without intending to marry her. Elizabeth, however, reiterated her conviction that Wickham lacked honesty and honor, citing his false accusations against Mr. Darcy and his wicked lies about the Darcy family. Upon their return to Longbourn, Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner joined Jane in looking after the children and attempting to calm Mrs. Bennet, who was in distress and blaming everyone but herself for the situation. Mrs. Bennet lamented not being allowed to take the family to Brighton and accused the Forsters of neglecting Lydia. She expressed fear that Mr. Bennet would fight Wickham in London and be killed. The atmosphere at Longbourn was tense, and Elizabeth was burdened with the knowledge that her family's reputation and Lydia's future hung in the balance. As the anxious wait continued at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet expressed her fears that Mr. Collins would turn them out of the house after Mr. Bennet's death. Mr. Gardiner reassured her and announced that he would be going to London the next day to help his brother-in-law. Mrs. Bennet, grateful for his support, pleaded with him to find Lydia and Wickham, ensure their marriage, and convey her distress to Mr. Bennet, emphasizing her poor health. The next day, Mr. Gardiner departed for London, leaving the Bennet family in suspense. Meanwhile, news from Meryton painted Wickham as a dishonest and profligate man with secret attachments to many servant girls in the town. While Elizabeth did not believe all the rumors, she feared for her sister's reputation. After a few days, the family received a letter from Mr. Gardiner, but it brought disappointing news. Wickham and Lydia had not yet been found. Wickham had left considerable gambling debts in Brighton, amounting to over £1,000. Mr. Bennet was returning home, leaving Mr. Gardiner to continue the search in London. Despite the uncertainty, Mrs. Bennet did not show the expected relief at her husband's return, expressing concern that he was coming home without Lydia. She worried about who would fight Wickham and make him marry her daughter. Mrs. Gardiner, keen on learning about Elizabeth's relationship with Darcy, took the opportunity of Mr. Bennet's return to go back to London with her children. The family's distress and uncertainty about Lydia's fate weighed heavily on everyone at Longbourn. Elizabeth's initial relief at the news of Lydia's impending marriage to Wickham was replaced by concern over the financial arrangements. Mr. Gardiner's letter revealed that although Lydia and Wickham had been found, they were not yet married. However, a deal had been struck with Wickham. Mr. Bennet was asked to pay Lydia £100 a year, and she would inherit her share of the £1,000, which would be divided among the Bennet girls after their parents' death. These conditions were set to ensure Wickham's agreement to marry Lydia. As Mr. Bennet explained the terms, Elizabeth and Jane became apprehensive about the financial burden this arrangement would place on their family. The immediate concern was repaying Mr. Gardiner, who seemed to have played a role in brokering the agreement by offering financial incentives to Wickham. Mrs. Bennet, however, was oblivious to these financial worries and was overjoyed that her daughter was to be married. She happily exclaimed that Mr. Gardiner, being Lydia's uncle, should pay for her wedding expenses. Mrs. Bennet was thrilled at the prospect of having a daughter married at the young age of 16, and she eagerly planned to write to her sister-in-law about the wedding clothes. While Mrs. Bennet reveled in her happiness, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel regret over her previous disclosure to Darcy about her concerns for Lydia. The situation unfolded in a way that brought about both joy and financial anxiety for the Bennet family. In response to Elizabeth's urgent note, her aunt in London promptly provided an explanation about Mr. Darcy's unexpected involvement in Lydia's marriage. The letter revealed that upon the day her aunt returned to London from Longbourn, Mr. Darcy visited them unexpectedly. Mr. Darcy informed them that he had discovered the whereabouts of Lydia and Wickham. Surprisingly, he expressed a sense of responsibility for not having exposed Wickham's true character earlier, believing that he was partly to blame. Mr. Darcy insisted on assisting in any way possible to rectify the situation. His motivation was rooted in a sense of duty to make amends for not revealing Wickham's true nature, which ultimately led to Lydia's elopement. This unexpected act of responsibility demonstrated a different side of Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth was left with new questions about his character and intentions. Elizabeth read her aunt's letter with a mixture of emotions, pleasure and pain. The revelation about Mr. Darcy's involvement in Lydia's marriage, driven by a sense of responsibility and honor, left her astonished. Despite his previous faults, his actions demonstrated a selfless commitment to rectifying the situation he felt partially responsible for. Mr. Darcy's efforts went beyond what anyone could have expected. He took the initiative to locate Lydia and Wickham, negotiate with Wickham on financial matters, and even attended the wedding to fulfill his promises. The letter also touched upon Mr. Darcy's relationship with a woman in London who had once been Miss Darcy's companion, suggesting a potential personal motive. Elizabeth grappled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was impressed and touched by Mr. Darcy's honorable actions. On the other hand, she couldn't help but question why he would go to such lengths for someone he supposedly disliked. The letter opened her eyes to a different side of Mr. Darcy, one that was willing to put aside his pride and prejudices for the sake of doing what he believed was right. As Elizabeth reflected on Mr. Darcy's actions, she felt a sense of pride for him overcoming his pride, and a deep regret for her own past criticisms and mockery of him. The complexities of her feelings for Mr. Darcy deepened, and she started to reevaluate her judgments about his character. The letter added another layer to the evolving dynamics between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, setting the stage for further developments in their relationship. Elizabeth observed Mr. Darcy's distant manner with her family. Despite her desire to express gratitude, she felt restrained by social conventions and the formalities that seemed to govern their interactions. As the dinner progressed, Mrs. Bennet continued her attempts to engage Mr. Darcy in conversation, often with misplaced comments and forced compliments. Elizabeth, sitting at a distance, could not help but cringe at her mother's behavior, especially considering Mr. Darcy's past generosity towards the family. While Mr. Bingley was amiable and friendly, Mr. Darcy maintained a reserved and composed demeanor. Elizabeth wondered whether his distant attitude was a result of her family's previous conduct or if there were other factors influencing his behavior. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth found herself increasingly disheartened by the lack of warmth and openness between her and Mr. Darcy. Despite the recent events that should have softened his opinion of her family, he seemed aloof and unapproachable. After the dinner, when the guests had departed, Elizabeth couldn't shake off the disappointment she felt. Her initial hopes of Mr. Darcy's continued regard for her family were overshadowed by the reality of his distant and formal behavior. The complexities of their relationship seemed to deepen, leaving Elizabeth with a sense of unease about what the future might hold. Elizabeth was in the garden when she saw Mr. Darcy arriving in his carriage. Even though he didn't visit often, he had come a few times after Lydia got married. Their interactions were usually formal, but Elizabeth couldn't forget how he helped in Lydia's situation. When Mr. Darcy approached her, he seemed serious and uncertain. He mentioned having an important matter to discuss. Elizabeth was curious, so she encouraged him to go on. Mr. Darcy then confessed that his feelings for Elizabeth had grown stronger over time. He acknowledged the impact she had on him and wanted her opinion on something important that might affect his happiness. This surprised Elizabeth, as she hadn't expected such a revelation. He explained that despite her refusal to his proposal earlier, circumstances had changed, and he felt compelled to revisit the idea of them being together. He asked if she would consider being in a relationship with him. Elizabeth was shocked by this unexpected declaration. She remembered their past and was unsure how to respond. The situation seemed to be taking an unexpected turn, and she wondered about the possibility of a different future with Mr. Darcy. Lady Catherine, Mr. Darcy's aunt, was furious and didn't believe Elizabeth when she said that Mr. Darcy was engaged to her daughter. She accused Elizabeth of spreading lies and insisted that her nephew would never make such a decision without consulting her. Elizabeth, staying calm, confirmed that Mr. Darcy and Lady Catherine's daughter were indeed engaged, with both families approving. She refused to discuss it further. Lady Catherine refused to accept this and argued that Mr. Darcy should marry in a way suitable to his status. Elizabeth firmly stated that the engagement was the decision of those involved, and she couldn't interfere. Lady Catherine, not satisfied, insisted that Mr. Darcy should be engaged to Elizabeth instead. Despite Lady Catherine's strong objections, Elizabeth stood her ground, not revealing more details and not letting herself be intimidated. After a tense conversation, Lady Catherine left abruptly, vowing to uncover the truth. Elizabeth was left puzzled by the unexpected encounter and wondered about Lady Catherine's true motives and the intensity with which she defended Mr. Darcy's supposed obligations. The revelation of Mr. Darcy's engagement to Lady Catherine's daughter added complexity to Elizabeth's relationships. Elizabeth, troubled by Lady Catherine's unexpected visit and ominous warnings, found herself caught in a web of uncertainty and anxiety. She considered the possibility that Lady Catherine had, in her overbearing manner, misconstrued Jane's engagement to Mr. Bingley as a prelude to her own supposed engagement to Mr. Darcy. As she pondered the potential consequences of Lady Catherine's interference, Elizabeth couldn't shake the fear that her future with Mr. Darcy might be jeopardized. Lady Catherine's threats and accusations, though baseless, carried the weight of social expectations and class distinctions. Faced with the prospect of Lady Catherine influencing Mr. Darcy against their union, Elizabeth grappled with a sense of powerlessness. Lady Catherine's visit, filled with disdain and warnings, had shaken her confidence, and she feared that the proud Mr. Darcy might succumb to familial pressures and reconsider their connection. Elizabeth felt a mixture of frustration and anger at Lady Catherine's attempts to control her life. She recognized the injustice in being judged solely based on her family's circumstances and couldn't accept the notion that her happiness should be dictated by societal expectations. Despite the uncertainty, Elizabeth remained steadfast in her resolve not to promise Lady Catherine anything. She couldn't agree to abandon her pursuit of happiness or compromise her principles to satisfy the expectations of others. As she contemplated the potential consequences of Lady Catherine's meddling, Elizabeth braced herself for whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to face them with resilience and integrity. When Elizabeth told Mr. Darcy about his engagement to Lady Catherine's daughter, he was visibly moved. The uncertainty between them lifted, and his expressions changed from anxiety to relief and, finally, genuine happiness. In a heartfelt moment, Mr. Darcy took Elizabeth's hand, expressing gratitude and happiness. Elizabeth, realizing she had misjudged him, felt touched by his emotions. As they walked back to the party, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth shared meaningful glances. Despite potential opposition to their engagement, they were focused on their connection and the understanding they had developed, overcoming past obstacles. The story of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy was entering a new chapter, marked by the promise of love and genuine affection triumphing over societal expectations. Mr. Darcy's proposal to Elizabeth brought a mix of emotions within the Bennet family. While Jane was initially astonished, she quickly embraced her sister's happiness, offering warm congratulations. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, had reservations, considering Mr. Darcy's pride and reputation. It took some persuasion from Mr. Darcy to convince him that his daughter's happiness was genuine. Mrs. Bennet, in her typical fashion, expressed her joy in her own unique way. She marveled at the wealth and social standing that would now be part of Elizabeth's life. Her earlier dislike for Mr. Darcy was quickly forgotten, replaced by admiration for his charm and handsomeness. As the engagement became official, the news spread throughout the neighborhood, and the Bennet family found themselves the center of attention once again. The local society, which had witnessed the ups and downs of the Bennet sisters, was surprised and intrigued by Elizabeth's match with Mr. Darcy. Amidst the gossip and speculation, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy were content in their newfound understanding and shared affection. They faced the challenges and objections with resilience, ready to embark on a life together that promised love, growth, and mutual respect. The unfolding events only served to reinforce the strength of their bond and the depth of their commitment to each other. The conclusion of Pride and Prejudice paints a picture of the characters' lives after Elizabeth Bennet's marriage to Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth's family, particularly her mother, experiences a mix of emotions. Mrs. Bennet, though initially concerned about the family's future, becomes proud of having two daughters in elevated social positions. Elizabeth's engagement brings relief, especially as she anticipates leaving Longbourn for the comfort and elegance of Pemberley. Mrs. Bennet is delighted when her daughters marry well, and Mr. Bennet misses Elizabeth but enjoys visiting her at Pemberley. Jane and Mr. Bingley relocate to a house near Pemberley, allowing the sisters to frequently visit each other. Mary stays at Longbourn, while Kitty improves her behavior, character, and intelligence by spending time with her elder sisters. Lydia and Wickham, who face financial challenges, receive assistance from Elizabeth and Jane. Despite their irresponsible behavior, the sisters continue to support them. Caroline Bingley is offended by Darcy's marriage but maintains politeness. Georgiana Darcy holds Elizabeth in high regard, creating a close bond. Lady Catherine, initially estranged due to her objections, eventually visits Pemberley. The novel concludes with a note of gratitude from Darcy and Elizabeth toward the Gardiners, recognizing their role in bringing the couple together by inviting Elizabeth to Derbyshire and facilitating the visit to Pemberley. The story ends on a positive note, with characters finding happiness and forming lasting connections.